public hearing.
Okay, John.
I know.
All right, everybody, we are going to start the meeting. Good evening. This is the March 9th, 2023 Town of Fishkill Planning Board meeting, and I'll call the meeting to order at 7:01 p.m. Please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, our usual announcements are to please silence your cell phones and to speak right up into the microphone so that people can hear well. Let's see, we have a couple of people who are excused from the meeting tonight. Anthony Brozier couldn't make it, and also alternate members Kevin O'Connell and Vijay Kalambi cannot make it, so they are excused. So we'll have 6 voting members present when Felix Lopez gets here, but we have 5 now, and that's a quorum. I would like to ask the board's consideration of amending the agenda for tonight's meeting to modify the order of agenda items by moving other business to be discussed just after Continental Commons and before Fishkill self-storage, and to add 2 items to other business to also be discussed at that amended time. That's basically to allow time for our planning consultant, Liz Axelson, to get here. She has another meeting, and she said she would probably get here by about 8:30. We're hoping that's the case. But by amending the agenda order, that might help things a little bit. So according to our planning board rules and regulations, if somebody would make a motion to amend the agenda for tonight's meeting, as I just discussed.
So moved.
Bob moved it, and Jody seconds it. Sorry. Any further discussion on that? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Any abstentions? So that passes. We have 5 voting members, so that's 5-0. Okay. All right. So with that, our first item on tonight's agenda is Continental Commons, Site Development Plan and Freshwater Wetlands Watercourse Water Body Permit. Board to review submission made by the applicant's representative on February 22, 2023, which includes a request for permission to clear trees for Phase 1 and a request for a 90-day extension of the Freshwater Wetlands Watercourse Water Body Permit. Welcome, Mr. Messenger. Maybe if you could just briefly describe the various requests.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Cantor. Stuart Messinger with LaBella Associates. Just a couple updates to start. We received a final, remember what we're trying to do is perfect our conditions of approval. We have preliminary approval from the board. There were a number of conditions, and we're down to just the last couple. We perfected our OPRH sign-off over the last couple of weeks. Ms. Colonna circulated a letter from OPRHP approving our plans in that regard. We received Mr. Bodendorf's single comment on the easements exhibits, so we'll certainly clean that up. Essentially, the only approval that we have left in order to satisfy the conditions is from the health department. We received a response to our latest submission a couple weeks ago. We're in the process of responding to that. We expect to get back to the health department in the next month or so, and then hopefully have their approval within the next couple of months, which brings us to the reason for the tree clearing request tonight. We're before you tonight for 3 matters, one of which we may or may not be able to talk about. The first one is just the extension of the wetland and watercourse permit, a 90-day extension on that, and we appreciate you bringing that to our attention at the last meeting. Hopefully that's pro forma. We've received several extensions on the site plan approval, and it's simply a matter of the time that we've taken. in particular because of the 2-year delay that we had on account of the lawsuit involving water and sewer. So that's one action. If you have comments, I don't know if council's had a chance to look at the various covenants and easements and whether that's up for discussion tonight, we'd be happy to do that. And if not, then to the future. And then the tree clearing request. I'll get to that in a second. In talking, Ms. Cologne made what I thought was a really excellent suggestion when I dropped off the materials a couple weeks ago, and she said, when you get that health department approval, resubmit everything in one package, because we've been kind of going along piece by piece as we've gotten the approvals, because on our end it goes a little bit faster that way, right? But it's hard for everybody to keep track of. So that's the one outstanding item really, other than the easements and covenants. So when we get that, we'll go ahead and make a submission that has everything in one package so you can see it in one place, and then hopefully we can move to final. So the third order of business is our request for you to allow us to clear trees prior to the final approval. As everybody knows, in this part of the world, we're generally subject on wooded sites to restrictions on tree clearing from April 1st through October 31st to the potential presence of Indiana bats, and that's a condition that we were certainly prepared to live with. Unfortunately, because we had a 2-year delay, not of our making, we've gone considerably, past a reasonable amount of time to get this thing approved. And so now we're looking at likely being back in front of you in the next couple months when we have the final health department approval, but then we have to wait again to the fall. And we think that's an issue, given the amount of time the applicants had to wait. Not his fault. You recall the verdict on that was a directed verdict from the judge saying the town had acted inappropriately and directing the town to give us water and sewer. So we think it's a reasonable request. You'd asked us for an inventory of trees on the site. We gave that to you. We had a certified arborist go out and look at the trees. There's a couple dozen that could potentially be bat habitat, so certainly not a lot of them. As I stand on the site and look up around me, I see tens, if not hundreds of thousands of trees. And so I have a hard time thinking that the loss of these trees for the summer months is going to have any impact on the bat population, if in fact their bats are there. And I'm not a bat, but I'm thinking I've got a mountainside full of trees. I've got a site that is next to a busy highway and that's lit at night from a gas station and so on. So probably not the best place in the event. So we think it's a reasonable request. We understand that we can't grub the stumps, because that gets us into disturbing the site and would require SWIP and so forth. What we'd like to do is simply take them down. We'd like to stack them neatly so that the site doesn't look like a mess. We'd like to be able to have equipment on the site to do that. We'd understand if you didn't want us to do that, and we do it by hand instead. So, so those are the 3 requests tonight: the extension of the water, wetlands and water permit, any comments on the legal documents, and then acting hopefully on the request to clear trees prior to March 31st. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Well, why don't we do the freshwater wetlands watercourse water body permit first? I think that's probably going to be the simpler of the 3, well, certainly of the 2 main items. So the freshwater wetlands watercourse water body permit was approved by the planning board and signed by the chair on March 20th, 2020. Then COVID came along and other things happened. So that permit was valid for 3 years and is due to expire on March 20th of this year. The permit may be extended by the planning board upon written request for 2 additional periods of 90 days each, from my reading. And so the applicant has submitted a written request for the first 90-day extension through June 19th, 2023. So, Dominic, do you see any issues or questions about that?
No, sir. I believe, based on Mr. Messenger's explanation and understanding of all the circumstances, the board would be in a position and based on my recommendation, should extend the permit.
Do board members have any questions or any input into that?
No.
All right. Would someone like to make a motion to extend the Continental Commons freshwater wetlands watercourse water body permit through June 19, 2023?
I'll do that. Second.
Fred moves it, and Felix seconds it. Any further discussion? All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? So that is 6 in favor and none opposed. We do have 6 voting members now. Yep. We have, Felix, as I was mentioning, 6 will be our full voting allotment for the night because we're missing Anthony and we have no alternate members tonight. Okay. Let's go to the tree clearing question. So something that came to mind as I was reviewing the plan for the tree clearing proposal is that plot 1, which is that area that's basically right off of, what is the name of that road?
Area right there.
Yeah.
Yep. Area in front of the gas station.
Yeah, right in front of the gas, just north of the gas station. That's actually the buffer area. Oh, okay, that's the corner of Snook Road and Route 9. That happens to be the area that's currently the subject of the restrictive covenant.
Correct.
That prohibits the removal of vegetation or disturbance until and unless the planning board approves the amendment of the restrictive covenant. So I had actually asked Dominic if you had a chance to take a look at that restrictive covenant and what, if any, ramifications that might have for allowing tree clearing in that area at this point.
Yes, I received your email and to myself and to Debbie. One of the difficulties in this matter is that the town has limited files in connection with this because of litigation as previously discussed and change in council. So as a result, on the one hand, we do not have a copy of the recorded restrictive covenant. But nonetheless, I have reviewed the proposed amendment to the restrictive covenant. This was something that was authorized by the board as part of its 2019 approval, and in connection with amending the restrictive covenant. Let me take a step back for a moment. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Messenger, but I believe the restrictive covenant was to create that buffer, as the chairman mentioned, along Snook Road for the preservation of that area. But then afterwards, as plans moved to conditional final approval, there was a proposal to have a visitor center at that location. Correct. And so as a result, there is a draft of an amendment to the restrictive covenant that would serve the sole function of allowing the visitor center to be constructed and the landscaping associated with that. And so I have reviewed the amendment. I have no concerns with its current draft. This is a document that is not an agreement. It's a restrictive covenant that gets placed on the property by the landowner. The original restrictive covenant was that way, and this is an amendment to it. I find that the proposed amendment meets the intent of the board, which would be to modify the buffer area solely for the purpose of allowing the construction of the visitor center and the associated landscaping with it, and would recommend that the board allow the project to move forward because it meets the intent of what was previously established by the board.
So I guess my only question, and maybe the board members have questions on this too, and of course, a number of the board members weren't involved in the original review, so haven't had a chance to really get their feet wet too much on the project per se. In fact, of all the people here, only Felix and myself, remember all the things that went into the project review. So, my question is how we would go about allowing the tree clearing in that Plot 1 restrictive covenant area without the planning board really having, the members especially who haven't seen it before or had a chance to think about it, how we would deal with that as part of the, what approval we have to give tonight on the tree clearing. So,
Is it your standard practice to have the board review the individual legal documents associated with this particular application or any others in general?
well, I think in this case, there are a number of agreements, easements, and documents that are part of the conditions of approval, right? I think there are probably like 8 or 9 or so different things, give or take. And most of them, no, most of them would be fairly standard legal, issues, but at least in my thinking, the restrictive covenant is kind of more of a use issue and, allowing things to happen on that parcel. So I don't know, I mean, why don't we go around board members and see if there are any questions or thoughts on that, but if, if there are hesitations on the restrictive covenant, in a sense, we're not going to be approving the restrictive covenant amendment tonight, because I don't think the board was really prepared to do that, but we could take a recommendation from you, Dominic, as the attorney, that, perhaps we could go ahead and approve the tree clearing in all 3 of the plots, which would be then subject to whatever other approvals or amendments might be needed, or something like that.
Correct.
So,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Remember, there's a time stamp on this, and that we need to have the clearing done before March 31st.
Yeah.
And so just so the board, a little background for the board, I appreciate your point. The original covenant was put in place at the time the gas station was built in order to provide some buffering between the Van Wyck house and the gas station. And if you go out there, it's not the best buffer in the world. It's kind of some thinly planted pines, but that's what it was there for. In its review of the project, the planning board found that the value of the visitor center to the public outweighed the value of that buffer, in essence, and I think Felix was there, and I see him nodding. That was really the finding, that the visitor center is a good thing. It's a benefit to the town. It's a benefit to the public. Helps celebrate the history of the Fishkill Supply Depot, and so it's worthy of cutting 40 trees down to build it.
well, yeah, Felix, do you have any questions or thoughts on that?
I think the approach you just laid out seems to make the most sense. This project's been going on a long time, and we went through a whole exhaustive review of this. And, I would hate to delay it even more just because of this. I think if Dominic, if you feel comfortable that we can do this, then I think we shouldn't let it stand in our way of giving you the opportunity to clear the trees and move it forward.
Yeah, I mean, we have a very detailed amendment to the restrictive covenant in the sense that it sets forth all of the legal history associated with the project. But the operative section is actually very clear that the amendment to that buffer area is solely for the purpose of allowing the visitor center to be constructed and associated landscaping that's part of the visitor center. So I think the document, despite the fact that it's several pages long, is actually really drives exactly at the point that the board was looking to achieve.
What about other board members who weren't involved in the original approvals?
And I haven't seen very many big trees between the gas station and, so there's really no blockage right now. You can see right through this time of year anyway.
Yeah, and probably of all the areas that have trees, this plot 1, which has the restrictive covenant, has the least, let's say, valuable trees on the site. Although, I mean, they were planted as opposed to probably being all originally natural. Or maybe, I mean, actually, some of them might have been original on the site when the gas station was built, but they're not like a real mature woods. How about you guys on this end? You have questions on that if we decided to move ahead with the motion? All right, so, yeah, and you had indicated that the applicant would be willing to basically at this time fell the trees only. I think probably as you mentioned, it would be better not to have heavy equipment in there moving, you know, the cut trees around, but if they need to be or can be stacked by hand, that would probably be the best approach.
Not sure that would be feasible.
Or, yeah, or, you know, or basically left in place. I don't know, I was going to ask you anyway, what do you anticipate the starting time, assuming, you know, final site plan approval is granted in a reasonable amount of time based on your submission of the plan materials?
Well, by starting time of cutting the trees or starting?
Of the actual construction for the project.
We're really going to be needing to make another submission to the health department, which probably will happen within the next month. They are not the fastest agency in the world. So let's give them a month, and then, so I'm hopeful 3 months, 2-3 months. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in terms of clearing the site, it can be done in a couple of days. The contractors lined up, I mean, it's not a lot of land, and that's a quick job. It would be far preferable to bring in some machinery to do it, because that will make it go quickly. We can't grub the stumps, right? But if we brought in the equipment, we lop them down and we stack them neatly. I personally think that's preferable than to have them lay down like pick 'em up sticks.
Yeah. All right, well, why don't we try this? I had put together kind of a little bit more of a complicated motion that the board could consider, and we can go from there and see what you think. So is there a motion to allow tree cutting in plots 1, 2, and 3 in Phase 1 as shown on the sheet TCP1, tree clearing Phase 1, Continental Commons, dated January 30th, 2023. That clearing to occur prior to March 31st, 2023, subject to the following. 1, felling trees only and leaving stumps intact in the ground and felled trees on the site to avoid ground disturbance until final site development plan approval has been granted by the planning board. Number 2, there shall be no tree clearing, let's see. Scratch number 2. That would have been covering plot 1. So we're scratching that. So number 2 then is as recommended in the bat habitat suitability report dated February 14th, 2023, and prepared by Beatty and Watson, Surveying and Engineering. If any bats are found to be present while the site is actively being worked, activity should be stopped, and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation Region 3 Division of Fish and Wildlife should be contacted on how to proceed. And number 3, applicant shall obtain the necessary tree clearing permit from the Town of Fishkill Building Department prior to any cutting of trees on the subject property.
Do you have a tree clearing permit? I looked online, didn't see one.
I don't know if that's the actual term for it.
But it is through the building department.
There is a permit, okay. I looked online, I mean, I didn't see such a thing.
I don't know what they call it.
Okay.
Why don't we
That's
just
a ministerial one.
why don't we just say the necessary permit from the Town of Fishkill Building
All the
Department?
departments do. 3322 is their extension.
3322,
Yep.
thanks.
All right, so with that modification, would someone like to move that?
So moved.
Second.
All right, Felix moves it, Fred seconds it. Any further discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, so that passes 6-0. All right, as far as the draft easement and covenant documents themselves. The planning board authorized the applicant's representatives to discuss these draft documents with their attorney and engineer. You may or may not have done that already, but that would probably be the proper forum for discussion, unless you have any specific questions that you'd like to direct to them at this point. I know that John Bodendorf had submitted a memo that just had a revision requested in exhibit tree easement number 2. So, I don't know, John, if you, it's a pretty straightforward.
Yeah, the map exhibit that accompanied the description was just missing one distance on
On one of the courses.
on one of the courses. So the description actually had the distance included, it was just omitted from the figure. So it's a real simple
I won't charge my client.
Yeah.
And Dominic, I don't know, did you have any questions for the applicant at this point, or any material that was missing, other than the original restrictive covenant? But I was able also to get a pretty good recollection of what the original restrictive covenant was about by looking at the amendment to it, so.
Yes, it was a very detailed document, so that was helpful. Thank you. There are certain documents that are conditions of the approval from the planning board that had to be finalized. I'll provide you with a separate memo as far as those are concerned in connection with satisfying conditions of site plan approval for the project, which will be necessary in order for the site plan itself to be signed and building permits issued and things like that. So you'll have a formal record of that moving forward. For the ones that are really within the planning board's scope of review and conditions determined to be met, there are 2 documents that, however, require town board input. One would be this, and not only input, but also approval. One would be the stormwater management agreement, and the other one would be the tree and brush clearing easement. Both of those require approval by the town board and signature by the supervisor in order for those to be recorded in the chain of title. The stormwater management agreement is a fairly standard agreement in the sense that it provides the town with the ability, but not the obligation, to enter onto the site in case stormwater facilities are not maintained in the future, make any corrections or maintenance that's required, and then charge back any costs associated with that to the property owner. So that no other taxpayers is paying for any kind of corrective work that's required there. This is a standard agreement that is required by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation as part of their general permit. The other agreement is an easement in favor of the town to go on and do tree and brush clearing in a very limited way, just for sight lines as far as that's concerned, for traffic and vehicular movements, and both of these have been sent over to Steve Gaba for his review so that he can then brief the town board when he has completed it. I will follow up with him separately as to where he is on that process, but I would encourage Mr. Messenger to connect directly with Mr. Gaba, and I can certainly facilitate that as well.
Great. And then in terms of will we be seeing a memo from you on the remainder of the easements?
Correct. That's what I suggested.
Okay, that's what I thought I heard.
Yes.
Okay. I'm advised by my client he'd like to submit some revisions to the burial area restrictive covenant, so I'll get those over to you, unless through you to. That's. I've been here enough to know the drill.
Come on.
Yep. Oh, I was just confirming that I knew. So we'll do that post haste, because he does have a couple things he'd like you to change on it. So we'll get those over to you. Okay. Great.
All right.
I think we're good. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm not sure if the applicant team for Fishkill Self-Storage was here when we amended the agenda. So we're going to do some other business items before we get to you. All righty, so the first item has to do with the Town of Fishkill Draft Comprehensive Plan Update. And the board is to review and discuss the Draft Comprehensive Plan Update dated November 8th, 2022. So I just wanted to indicate that the town board has been reviewing the Draft Comprehensive Plan Update. That's the draft dated November 8th, 2022, and also the draft generic environmental impact statement that's dated February 7th, 2023. Public hearings have been scheduled for Wednesday, March 15th on the draft generic environmental impact statement, and on Wednesday, April 5th on the draft comprehensive plan update document. So the CPU committee met yesterday, actually, to review comments that Dutchess County Department of Planning and Development had submitted for their GML review, and to discuss possible revisions to the draft CPU to address some of the comments and recommendations from the county. So it is quite likely that the draft CPU document will be revised based on the county's GML comments, and it could also address any other comments that are made by the public during the public hearing or in written comments. So I guess if there are substantive comments to the draft CPU that are submitted, there would most likely be an additional opportunity for public comments on the revised CPU. But if they're mainly things like format changes or, kind of clarifications or minor additions, there may or may not be an additional time frame for public comments to be made. So, again, the CPU committee met last night. We did go over some possible revisions. Most of them were kind of format changes. For instance, putting the detailed survey results into an appendix instead of having it, like 10 pages worth of details in the text itself, and probably make it easier to read and reference that way. That would be the kind of thing that the committee, was going over last night. Some other things too, like the large parcel analysis that we did, had some detailed parcel sheets. There were 25 large parcels of 25 acres or larger that were analyzed with some suggestions on how to approach those in the future. And those detailed sheets would also most likely go in an appendix. And then we went through a bunch of other stuff. Fred, you're on the committee. I don't know if you recall anything else that the committee did.
No, we didn't.
That was about
There's
it.
a lot of minutia we moved around, did that type of a thing, but it was...
Yeah. And the committee did schedule a tentative date for another committee meeting on April 12th, 2023, so that the committee could review any revisions that our consultant CPL is putting together. And Liz Axelson also has been doing a great job with CPL of helping the committee and the town board out with the proposed comprehensive plan update. So the document also will become a little bit longer because we're going to be adding maps and photographs to help illustrate the plan details and recommendations. So so what I'm getting to toward the end of this item on the agenda is to ask board members if you as planning board members are interested in submitting any comments for the public hearing. on the CPU draft, which again is scheduled for later in April. So we'll get to that in a minute, but first I thought what I'd do is just highlight very briefly some of the kind of the main points in the update of the plan, which go a little bit above and beyond or a little bit different from the 2009 plan. So we now have a draft vision statement on page 2. That's in the draft plan. Again, I mentioned the survey and the results. That's new since that was brand new for this plan update. So there's an executive summary of the survey starting on page 4 of that document. There's a change in the order and priorities of the goals and recommendations of the plan compared with the 2009 plan. I think that was a point that Liz Axelson stressed when we were reviewing it last night. And going through some of the actual goals and objectives, Goal A is connect people and places, so on pages 11 to 16. The plan update, I think, has an expansion and greater emphasis compared to the 2009 plan on things like sidewalks and pedestrian paths, trails, to some degree certain specific road and intersection problems and possible improvements that the 2009 plan didn't really get into detail on. Goal B is promote good design and built environment. So pages 17 to 26 of the plan kind of emphasize compact mixed-use development in certain areas with areas that have adequate infrastructure to encourage walking and public transit. Again, as I mentioned, the plan includes a new large parcel development potential analysis on pages 19 to 23, and it includes suggestions for how to approach development on some of the vacant, underutilized parcels in the town. And I think also, in a way, maybe more significantly, it includes suggestions for preserving parcels with significant open space and natural features in the town. Goal D, economic and social diversity, page 29, reiterates and strengthens recommendations from the 2009 plan to provide a full range of housing types and to accommodate affordable workforce housing. Goal E is conserve critical lands, page 30 of the draft plan. That kind of follows up on the 2009 plan recommendation for a new recreation zone, as they called it in that plan. That was never adopted, but we have a new recommendation for what we're calling a conservation zoning district to preserve large parcels with significant open space and natural features. Goal F is preserve significant environmental resources, pages 33 and 35 of the plan update. That incorporates proposed New York State drinking water source protection program that the town has been working on through a different committee, and the recently adopted town aquifer protection overlay zone regulations, and also recommends consideration of preparing new tree preservation regulations. And Goal I, create and enhance gateways, page 37 of the plan update, strengthens and recognition of gateway entrances to the town compared with the 2009 plan, and it emphasizes consideration of the use of design guidelines to preserve the character of those gateway entrance areas to the town. And there's also a new implementation planning outline, pages 39 to 44, with strategies and timeframes to implement recommendations in the plan update. So, as I mentioned before, the board members have had the plan update draft for about 3 months now, I think. So, of course, Fred and I, both being on the committee, we've had plenty of opportunities ourselves to provide direct input into the plan preparation. So it wouldn't really be appropriate for me or Fred, per se, to necessarily suggest comments for the public hearing on the plan update, since we've been directly involved in it. But this is the opportunity, I think, if planning board members would like to send any comments to the town board for the public hearing. And again, there are actually two public hearings. One is on the generic environmental impact statement, March 15th. Probably the more relevant one, I think, for this board would be the April 5th public hearing on the plan document itself. So I guess I just wanted to take the opportunity to see if board members had any comments or observations on the CPU document, and whether or not the board would like to send any specific or general comments to the town board for the public hearing. If not, that's perfectly okay, but this is the opportunity to see what you think, or see if you have any comments or suggestions on it.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I've been looking at the update for last bunch of weeks, and I haven't been able to find anything that stands out to me as something I could say I think I would like to see changed. So I actually wish I was on that board. It seems like you guys have done a great job. Because when I looked at the old plan, I actually have it in paper at home.
So do I.
Yes, and so it seems like real improvements have been made, and I think you're moving in a good direction. I'm not done yet, so I'm hoping that maybe I might have something for that meeting, but right now I don't see anything that stood out to me that I would think is something that would be something I would like to have changed or made better.
Yeah, and I would certainly encourage any individual planning board members to show up at the April 5th public hearing at the town board meeting, make comments directly there if you would like to, or submit your own individual letters. That's something else that you could do. I don't know if any other board members have had a chance to look at it, or if you have any thoughts or ideas that you want to talk about now, or if you'd rather wait till the public hearing and make some comments there, that's okay too. Jody, any thoughts? Okay. Robbie?
Nothing in particular right now.
Okay. How about you, Bob? Any thoughts on the plan?
Still looking through it, trying to.
I can tell you, I had 2 years of giving input.
Yeah, that's true. We started the process when COVID was kind of putting a halt to things, but it didn't put a halt to us. We met remotely by Zoom meetings for probably the first full year of the plan preparation, and have been working pretty steadily up until the last few months when the plan kind of turned more towards the environmental review process. So that's almost done now. And I'd certainly encourage any members of the public to, if you haven't had a chance to take a look at the plan documents, they're on the town's website, pretty easy to access. And certainly if you feel like doing it, show up at the town board public hearing on April 5th and make any comments that you would like to about the plan update.
Is there any target date when the documents will be finalized?
It's a good question, yeah. I think that depends on how many public comments are received and what types of comments are received. Our tentative committee meeting in April is to go over any of those possible comments and see what types of responses or changes in the plan might be necessary. So if all goes well, I think it's possible that the plan could be adopted toward the end of April or maybe beginning of May. So yeah, it's been a pretty long process, but as far as comprehensive plans and updates go, 2 years isn't really all that much. So it's moved along pretty steadily and expeditiously, and it's getting close.
And these kind of revisions happen like every 5-10 years or something like that?
Yeah, it's recommended that they happen every 5 years or so, but it turns out that most towns and villages don't really do it every 5 years, as evidenced by the fact that our plan preceding this one was 2009, so it's been 14 years now. And some communities wait even longer than that. But if you have regular review periods, then you don't have to go through as long an update process each time you do it. So every 5 years is recommended. Yeah. All right, so any other questions or anything else that members would like to mention regarding the plan update? If not, we will move on to another item of other business, which I wanted to go over. And this is basically reporting on a meeting that was set up with the town supervisor regarding procedure for establishing performance bond amounts for site development plans. So after the planning board's discussion regarding performance bond amounts that we had at our last meeting, John Bodendorf set up a meeting on February 16th with Supervisor Alba to clarify the procedure for determining performance bond amounts. And Dominic Cordisco and I also attended. And I thought it was a very productive and good meeting, and we agreed on kind of certain things that probably first and foremost was that coordination among the planning board, town board, and the applicant would be required to make the process work smoothly. So I'm just going to go through my recollection of what we went over at the meeting, and then I'll turn to John and Dominic to see if what I said was accurate, or if you have anything you want to update or add to it. But so, the first thing we did was obviously we looked at the town code provisions where the requirements for performance bonds for site development plans are specified in section 150-97D of the Town of Fishkill Code, which states the following. As a condition of approval under this article, the planning board may require the posting of a performance bond with supporting security. The purpose of the bond is to cover the cost of site improvements required by site plan approval, including but not limited to grading, erosion and sedimentation controls, landscaping, stormwater management improvements, sidewalks, etc. And of course, that word "et cetera" is always an interesting one, but not including building construction, so that's clear. And the amount of such bond shall be based on an estimate submitted by the applicant, reviewed and approved by the planning board's engineer, and approved by the town board. So based on the discussion at the meeting, it was clear that the estimate to be provided by the applicant should not necessarily include the cost of all site work for the project, because that can amount to a lot of kind of extraneous things that that add up to a lot of money and aren't really relevant necessarily to a performance bond or the purposes of a performance bond. So we kind of agreed that the estimate should focus on the estimated cost of site improvements cited in the code, but also reasonably related to public safety, use, and impacts of site development on surrounding areas. And so here's what we kind of agreed to for the steps to accomplish the code requirement for performance bonds. So bear with me while I go through these. So first, the planning board engineer should request from the applicant a realistic estimate of the cost of relevant site work sufficiently ahead of the planning board's consideration of final site development plan approval. And this would be final site plan approval is where we would address this, because usually preliminary site plan approval addresses other things which are more preliminary. Now, sometimes we also do preliminary and final site plan approvals at the same time in one resolution, and so that would also be the case where performance bonds would be addressed. The planning board engineer would communicate to the applicant what elements of site improvements the estimate should include. Example, the things mentioned in the code: grading, erosion and sediment controls, landscaping, stormwater management improvements, sidewalks, but not including building construction. The applicant submits the estimate to the planning board engineer in an appropriate time frame prior to consideration of final approval. The planning board engineer then reviews the estimate and provides a memo to the planning board, which would really be just part of your normal final engineering memo, prior to final approval, stating that he or she has reviewed and approved the estimate or recommends a modified amount to the planning board based on knowledge of the site work proposed. The amount of the approved estimate for the performance bond amount will be included in the draft resolution of final site development plan approval, with appropriate wording indicating that the recommended amount of the performance bond was determined by an estimate provided by the applicant, presented to the planning board by the planning board engineer, and is subject to approval by the town board. Upon adoption of the planning board resolution of final approval, the planning board engineer would circulate a memo to the town board supervisor, town clerk, and town board attorney indicating that the planning board approved the project and is requiring the posting of a performance bond with a recommended amount specified in the planning board resolution based on the estimate provided by the applicant. And a copy of that estimate would be provided with the memo to the town board, subject to approval by the town board as required in the code. Upon receipt of the planning board engineer's memo, the town clerk will place consideration of approval of the performance bond amount on the next available town board agenda. And also, as specified in the code, the performance bond shall be in a form acceptable to the town attorney. So that's basically what my notes and recollection of the meeting entailed. I do want to thank the supervisor and Dominic and John for participating in the meeting, because I thought it was a really good clarification of what the process should be. And so that's kind of it. I just wanted to see if John or Dominic, if you had any specific comments or clarifications or other thoughts on what we discussed.
I don't have anything other than that to add. I think you did a good job of summarizing what we discussed.
Thank you.
And it's going to be helpful going forward with these, because we found that we were waiting until the authorization of a draft resolution to try and get all this crammed in before the next meeting. So now we'll be in better position to request the information ahead of time so that there's more time to look at these.
And then hopefully we won't get kind of huge amounts of construction estimates in the $15 million range on a project that is going to be pretty expensive, but a lot of the estimate on that particular project that we were talking about last month were a lot of things that wouldn't normally be covered in a performance bond, like demolition and other things like that. So I think it'll probably result in a better, more efficient process, and also probably more reasonable estimates for initially from the applicant on the estimate of the relevant parts of construction.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, one of the difficulties, I think, and the challenges has been the fact that from a developer's point of view, when an estimate is prepared, they're preparing an estimate for their site work costs, and that gets submitted to the board and leads to confusion because it has a number attached to it, but it includes items that, may not necessarily need to be secured for bonding purposes. So I think the process that you outlined, and thanks to John for putting that meeting together, will be helpful and should expedite that process moving forward.
Any questions or comments from board members?
So this is just for really a preparation of the property before construction goes up, correct?
Well, it's in conjunction with our approval of the project, and the performance bond itself stays in effect basically through construction of the entire project.
Okay, but how does it handle with the one problem that we do have, what still have, with the project at 52 and 82? How would it, and another one I have is the one in East Fishkill where they started to build a big dome. They put up the walls and,
Yeah. And anyone want to take a shot at that? I have some thoughts, but,
Please.
Well, it's my understanding that that particular project is the reason why this was put into the code, so that the town wouldn't be put in that position again. So if someone were to walk away, the town would now have an avenue to call the bond and do what they had to do to clean the site up.
so that would handle that.
yeah, it wouldn't be for the town to actually complete building of the project, because we're not in that business.
Well, I understand that.
But it would enable the town to go in and in other ways, separate from, I think, what the town board had to do, which was a lengthy, time-consuming process of basically all kinds of notices to the landowner and putting whatever it's called on the tax bill, a constraint, levy on the tax bill of the owner. That's a very complicated process.
Well,
but
no, I understand. I just want to make sure that,
yeah, no, I'm trying to explain to you
because
what,
as you were saying this, it didn't sound like it had to do with the building, so,
No.
that's correct.
so.
It's site improvements. That's
So-
what performance bonds
So if
typically
the
are
bond
for.
was called, what could the town do at that point? Cover it up?
Basically
tear it
clean,
down?
basically clean up the site, tear down whatever, wasn't completed, that's an eyesore, that is just kind of left halfway done. So that site out on 5282 was a mess. There's no question about it, and that's precisely why the town board wanted to see a performance bond provision in the site plan regulations.
Well, I just wanted to make sure that, as you've been describing it, it will cover that
Yeah.
particular whatever. Is there anything we can put in, being on the comprehensive plan, the big complaints that we have with the eyesores? All right? Everybody who came into the survey had the eyesores. And the other eyesore we had, which we're correcting now, is the old Duchess Mall. And I don't, and I know that goes back in the 70s, so, you can't handle that. But if there's anything in the future where somebody abandons a piece of property,
Yeah, that's another issue.
I'm just throwing it out at you.
And
It's
there are other code provisions that deal with abandoned and unsightly properties, which are the responsibility of the building department to implement. So you can ask the building department how they handle those things.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
I thought when we were here the last time and we were talking about the performance bond, when I had mentioned using it to clean up or something, someone said, no, that's a restorative bond or something, or restoration bond. So I'm not really sure.
Yeah, you want to...
Like, I distinctly remember her saying, you have the wrong you're using it in the wrong whatever context.
Well, it isn't the wrong context, and a lot of communities, in my experience, have used performance bonds to do that, so it's not wrong to do it.
Okay.
But there are also other types of bonds, like maintenance bonds and restoration bonds, that can be used, and sometimes they're used in conjunction or separately from performance bonds.
Okay.
For instance, we do use maintenance bonds to maintain landscaping for a year after completion. And some communities do have restoration bonds. I don't remember if we talked about that at the meeting, a little bit about should the town have, in effect, another code provision for restoration bonds?
We did, and suggested that might be an action for the town board to consider, would be a separate code provision that would specifically require a restoration bond for projects that were commenced but not completed, where, to your points, Fred and others, if work is started on a site but is abandoned and left abandoned for a period of time, the town may want to consider having provisions in there so that the town could enter onto the site and do some work to address the eyesores, as you put it. In my mind, a performance bond, is attached to a very specific type of work. So for instance, if you're securing performance of stormwater quality controls, like a stormwater pond or sidewalks, which are specifically called out in the code provision. And so for instance, if the CHI project moves forward, they have to put in sidewalks. And for whatever reason, if construction is started on that project, sidewalks are started, but for whatever reason, construction stops, the town would be in a position to call that bond to complete the sidewalks, for instance, so that you don't have half-built sidewalks. It's really to make sure that work that's going to affect others is going to be completed. If the town wants to impose a restoration bond for projects that are commenced but then are abandoned and then become eyesores, in my opinion, that falls into a different category. But these would be a town board matter as far as I'm concerned.
Possibly have
So, Dominic?
2 different bonds on a project?
You can have a lot of bonds. You have a maintenance bond as well.
Maintenance bond, yeah, okay. No, I just wanted to make sure that's what I was hearing you were saying.
Yeah.
Jody? Go ahead.
Dominic? So
Yes, ma'am.
what would have, I'm going to just focus in on one thing right now. Texaco, the old Texaco facility. Let's say they are maintaining the property. If a tree goes down, they clean it up, they, try to remove snow and stuff. That's an eyesore. How would you, I don't understand how, with all the rules and regulations, there's the eyesore that we talk about with 52 and 82. Look how much we're still jumping through hoops to try to get onto the property to be able to even do something. I'm not sure, like with Texaco, what can you do? The property is owned by, I believe, a corporation. They're barely maintaining it. They're doing what they have to do to keep it maintained. But it's an eyesore, and it's a fairly large eyesore.
Would you happen to know when that was approved?
Happen to know what?
When it was approved?
When was it?
Oh, my gosh.
Long
Probably,
time
it's
ago.
been there for a long
1930,
time, but
but
it's been vacated for
20s,
decades.
30, it was in the 30s.
Yeah,
Right.
it preceded zoning
So,
even.
but that goes to my point is, that the purpose of many of the conditions of approval that you do now are to address situations like that where you don't have those controls in place otherwise. And for instance, having a site plan approval that has very specific conditions on it as to how snow removal is going to be handled, or how stormwater maintenance facilities are going to be maintained, is important, because then that gives the town the hook to make sure that those things are done in the future. But for sites that preceded or predated rather, those types of approvals, then you don't really have much leverage and ability to determine compliance with that.
But even with the value of $1, let's say I start a project today, and you take a bond from me of, let's say, I don't know, $1 million, because you think that's fair. But 10 years from now, that $1 million is a drop in the bucket when I've done something to the property that now has to be addressed.
I hear what you're saying, and certainly inflation is something that could always be taken into account. The purpose, I think, of a performance bond, not to debate this, but it is to complete construction in that case for something that has been started but perhaps not completed. So for instance, like if a project is not begun at all, then as the chairman said, like the town's not in a position of going out and building someone's project for them. The real risk comes with, for instance, stormwater that's begun, where stormwater management ponds are started but not completed. And then as a result, during storm events, you have untreated or not correctly treated stormwater that's leaving the site perhaps, and to the detriment of other properties, other users, and the environment in general. In that case, the town having a performance bond has the ability to go in and finish the work, associated with it. But there's also maintenance bonds, and so maintenance bonds are also required to make sure that those features that have the ability to impact, the general public are also maintained. But these are all, to be quite honest, town board issues, because these are town board requirements. I mean, certainly the planning board, can make recommendations to the town board as to things that, like additional tools he would like to see, for projects. And so, bring this back to our meeting, one of the things that I had suggested is, and I did send a follow-up message to the supervisor codifying this and bringing Mr. Gaba into the discussion, is that the town may want to, the town, by meaning the town, and I mean the planning board, but primarily the town board, because it's the town board that legislates. The town board may want to consider some form of restoration bond, because that gets to the facility at 52 and 82, and I think to some of the concerns that you have potentially on other projects if they're started but not completed.
And actually, I'm thinking about Texaco, that,
Bob, I can't hear you.
no, I'm saying, as far as the Texaco project, I guess, it's not really a project, it was a property that was owned by Texaco, whether it was sold or not, I'm not sure the legality, but it wasn't a project that was started that someone had to put a performance bond on. They cleaned up the property, they left the foundations in, and they fenced it in, and what you deem as an eyesore is all to different people. I mean, you could level it out, somebody would say it's too open or everything else, so I don't think there's any kind of thing you can do on that. It's different when something starts like on 52 and 82, like Dominic said, there's a couple of different bonds that if there was in play, let's say they went three quarters away with the project, they could have finished the project off. Now, I don't know what that does, because then they'd have to try to get the property from the owner and sell it to someone to use as a storage facilities and reclaim their money. But like in schools, I've been plenty of times on projects where the GC goes under, bonding company comes in and has to finish the project because you need the school. And they have maintenance and everything else, and so all the subs get paid. Yeah, and that's tough for some people too, because like, I'm sure there's a lot of people got left holding the bag that were building on that property on 52 and 82. So, but as far as Texaco goes, that's something that was kind of like looked like a Duchess Mall.
Yeah.
What it looked like.
Yeah.
It's like somebody's house in your neighborhood. You don't like the way they keep it. It looks like a trash bin, but there's only so much you can do.
But that's different if it's someone's home
Yeah, I
and
just,
they're in there.
just trying to say, like, I think that Texaco,
I think the
unfortunately,
bigger
is-
problem is when businesses move. Like, I wonder, for myself, when Healy's over in their new building, what's going to happen to the other two buildings? I don't know. Maybe they'll use it for something else, or maybe someone's buying it. But if not, it's going to end up being a situation like the Duchess Mall.
Like that.
You drive into Fishkill and you see these dilapidated, vacated buildings that are falling down. I'm not sure how one would get money for that, because I just don't know. I think it's
think you do.
not a performance thing. Do they get their performance bond back when they're done, Dominic?
Yes.
Okay, so they get that money back. So once the project's done, great, it's done, hooray, here's your money back. Then what happens if 10 years later, 15 years later, 20 years later, they leave because their business plan didn't work out and now the building crumbles? I guess that's where the restorative thing comes in.
Yeah, that's what
Yeah,
I
you
thought,
can't.
so that-
There's no way to, that's like anything else. That happens.
Yeah, and it's more complicated in the case you were mentioning, where the current Healy buildings are in the city of Beacon and the new facilities in the town of Fishkill. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's, there's a lot of stuff that's driven by market conditions and economics. So we can't do everything. We can't control everybody's life in every way, but we can do things to protect the public's health, safety, and general welfare. That's really what the job of the town board and the planning board are primarily.
I have another question. You said performance bond shouldn't be on the entire cost of the construction. It's only on certain items. But the approval that we gave last month, we covered the entire cost, right? I mean, the CHI.
Well, I think
So-
that resulted in a long discussion at the planning board meeting about,
But we
Sure.
finally mentioned the full entire cost, so do we have to change it? I mean,
that's what we were talking about. The whole meeting that we had with the supervisor was to try to focus the estimated amount of construction on those elements that are really relevant to what a performance bond should be covering, not the overall cost of construction of the project. So, and a lot of it is cited specifically in the town's code. So you need to look at the code and see what it says.
so are we changing that approval? I mean,
No.
changing the numbers?
No, because it's ultimately up to the town board to decide the amount of the performance bond. That's directly from the code. That's how it's set up. So anyway, I don't want to revisit the discussion we had at our last meeting, because we do have another application to go through, and we already, I'll say, spent more than enough time on that discussion. So let's not revisit that. But what I did want to ask the board about was suggesting the possibility that if the board was so inclined, we could add this procedure that I outlined, which gets back to, the actual core of the meeting that I was discussing, all the different time points and timeline of
Well, that sounds
the
like a great
performance
idea. It
bond.
does sound like a great idea, because,
So
you
we-
already said it doesn't leave it till the last minute, it can be put in earlier.
Yeah, so what I was thinking is that if we wanted to, we could put that directly into the planning board's rules and regulations, where we have a lot of other things, a lot of other procedures spelled out. It would take, I'd be perfectly happy to put together an amendment to the rules and regulations that could do that, which basically is outlining what I read here. If the board thought that was a good idea, or, not sure, John or Dominic, if you think that would be an appropriate thing to do, or a good idea to sort of memorialize it in writing.
Yeah, I do think that would be helpful.
Because we do have a couple other projects that are going to have the same thing coming up shortly.
Yeah, well, the idea was that it would become an established procedure that we will do from here on in, but putting it in the rules and regulations would make it a little bit more clear and specific that that's what we're going to be doing until and unless we amend it to do something else. So, okay, what I'll do, I won't guarantee when that will be ready for the board to look at, but at some point, I'll surprise you and put something on the agenda for consideration of amending our rules and regulations to do that.
I have one thing, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
In that discussion with the supervisor, was there any talk about what the amount, is there a formula on how the town board will come up with that amount? Because it seems like there doesn't seem to be a set formula right now. They give a number, and then the town board decides their number. And I'm wondering if there should be more of a set formula so that this way the applicant doesn't have to guess how much their performance bond's going to be. They're going to know it's going to be a certain percentage. I don't know if there was any discussion on that, because I feel the code in the beginning to me was already confusing, but then it seems like it's just arbitrary what that number could become.
No, I don't think there was any discussion
Okay,
of
well,
that.
that would be something I would ask that the town board consider. You know, I know they all watch and the supervisor watches and.
I mean, how does the board decide
yeah.
what should
Yeah, and
be
that's what I'm talking about, because I think,
Yeah.
you know, it shouldn't be just up in the air where it should, they should have some idea.
I thought the applicant was going to give the number to our engineer.
Yes, they give the number to the engineer. Engineer comes up with the number, but then the town board decides what the bond's going to be, right?
Yeah,
You know?
That's correct.
So so basically, I would just make up a number. Let's say it's 10 million. Well, what's the board going to say the performance bond's going to be? They could say it's $10, they could say 5 million. Is there I think there should be a set formula that people know. They go, okay, it's going to be so much percent of what the estimate would be. That's, again, I think it's something that should be discussed, because that would definitely clarify that part of the code, just on my opinion.
So that's something I'm perfectly willing to have other board members communicate with the town board on. I think I spent enough time on this question for now.
Well, I just did. I know they're watching, so if they could think about that, it'd be great.
Right.
Okay. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, and so one final thing before we get to continuation of project reviews, just a quick reminder on the New York Planning Federation's annual Planning and Zoning Conference in Saratoga Springs, April 16th to 18th. Mentioned this at the last meeting. I am pretty sure I'm going to go to the whole conference at this point, so I'll handle my own registration, but if anyone else is interested, I think we do have some monies in the planning budget that would cover registration at the conference if anyone wants to attend. So take a look again at the registration materials if you are interested, and it'll be a good conference, and the first in-person conference that the Planning Federation has had in a couple of years. So, okay. All right. So let's move on and continue with project reviews. And so we will go to Fishkill Self-Storage, Site Development Plan and Special Use Permit. Board to review submission made by the applicant's representative on February 22, 2023, and to possibly review a draft FEAF Part 2 and discuss the secret process. Welcome.
Good evening, Chairman Cantor. I think I might be able to fill some of that void until the planner arrives. So now that the filibuster has ended, if I may, for the record, I'm Taylor Palmer. I'm a partner with the law firm of Cuddy and Fader on behalf of the applicant. I am joined by Phil Greeley, our traffic consultant from Collier's Engineering, as well as our project planner, Aaron Werner from AKRF, and we're also joined by Larry Paggi, the project engineer. For those on the board, our architect is R.E.A. Siegel, a very well-known architect for the new buildings, as the chairman had mentioned, in the city of Beacon, as well as Beth Selig of Hudson Cultural Services, who is our historic district and cultural resource consultant. As the chairman stated, we are before you this evening in connection with the continued seeker review of our applications for a proposed passive, low-impact, two-story self-storage facility use on the project. And that's being pursued pursuant to your town code section 150-19B. It's a special permit. While the project has been in development for some time, I'd be remiss to not wish this board a happy anniversary. And it's 1 year since we've been before your board, and like many anniversary wishes, it's late. We originally submitted this in 2021 for our pre-application submission, and is more fully detailed in our February 22nd supplemental submission to your board. And while my much better looking colleague Alec Glad has been before you previously, our team of consultants have been working with you and the board's consultants to demonstrate that the project's substantially similar to other permitted use in the RB zoning district, which is where the project is presently classified. Before I turn it over to Mr. Warner, so I can steal a few more of his talking points, to summarize some of the important details in our extensive seeker full EAF supplemental narrative that Mr. Warner and AKR have prepared, we do want to sort of take a quick step back to frame the discussion that's really before the board at this time. When we distill this application that's before you and the board, the applicant is simply trying to present a use, and we're quoting the zoning code here, so I'll give you my air quotes. According to the zoning code, that a use that may be allowed by special permit of the planning board, if it is determined by the planning board with input from the building inspector that the use is substantially similar to other uses listed in the district and is consistent with the stated purposes of this district. So that's the language of the section of the code that we're discussing with you all this evening. Notably, the stated regulations don't say that the action is subject to seeker, notwithstanding comments from the planning board's attorney memoranda regarding seeker. And while it's our position, that's because it's likely consistent with or tantamount to a determination, which would otherwise, if it were done by the building inspector alone, be exempt from the seeker regulations as a type 2 action. However, while we respectfully submit our submissions to the board clearly demonstrate compliance with these special permit criteria, we did retain a planning consultant who is here with us this evening, as well as a cultural, historic, resource consultant, in addition to the existing architect, engineer, and other consultants for our project team, to review the scope of the application and to add formal discussions regarding a site plan for this application, which has led to the more broader seeker discussion that we're involved with you all. Well, for the sake of the argument, and while we're known to be paid by the word, to set the stage for my colleague Aaron just a bit, and to wear the hat of our architect, it bears repeating that the applicant is designing a two-story, I know there was a comment in the planner's memorandum, a two-story, 51,500 square foot self-storage facility. And again, it's designed to be reminiscent of the brick light industrial structures that are part of Beacon and Fishkill's past, real cities and towns and villages that have come together, whether they were Fishkill Landing, Matawan, and now what we know as Beacon, and of course, as the masthead behind you all says, one of the original 9 towns in Dutchess County. The building is indeed designed, as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, by an architect who's done for the last several decades a reinvigoration of the city of Beacon. We're here in the town of Fishkill, but we're on the south side of the highway. And we brought him on because it's been so common now that the buildings that we're seeing are actually referred to as Beacon brick. So even if they're in the town of Fishkill, the brick itself has been considered Beacon brick. And that's something that's being considered as part of this application, is its consistency with being an entrance both to the town of Fishkill from those leaving Beacon and also those exiting the town of Fishkill headed to Beacon. So it's an important site, and this application is consistent with those considerations. Although those leaving from Beacon may not know that we're actually in the town of Fishkill on this side of the highway. So the self-storage facility will be set back substantially, as you can see on the site plan that's up on the board, from the property lines, and we're also providing substantial screening of the property. And the building itself is going to be built with much higher quality finish than many self-storage buildings that you can drive by in the town and part of what may have been discussed earlier tonight. The facades are broken up with projected brick piers and windows instead of typical long unbroken planes. Again, reminiscent of the factory history of this area, and again, with Beacon Correctional Facility, or excuse me, the Fishkill Correctional Facility up on the hill, and this general location of the project. This gives the building a scale and sense of scale, excuse me, related to the surrounding neighborhood, and provides visual interest and not just, you know, a supposed storage facility. Most importantly, and I know this has been highlighted before, but it bears repeating, this is a low traffic generating use. Of course, your planner highlights that's just one of the considerations, which is why we brought Aaron on to go through all of the many uses, hotels, other much more intense uses that could otherwise be permitted today on the site. But of course, we are a property that is surrounded on 3 sides by state highways. Land has been taken from this property by the state to widen those roads, and we've provided for additional lands to allow for further widening on those 2 sides. Of course, and most importantly, we have a 4th side. That 4th side is our residential neighbors. This project is designed to be a beautiful building for what it can be, while being a low traffic generating use, consistent with the area, and most importantly, consistent with the criteria for making a determination that it's consistent with other uses. In our case, less impactful. The project has been designed to be fully compliant with the RB zoning district bulk requirements, notwithstanding, of course, the determination that we need to and are appealing to the Zoning Board of Appeals as it relates to the lot size. We're 0.3 acres as a result of a taking of the New York State DOT, so again, that's an existing nonconformity. We're preserving 70% of this site. And thank you, actually, the filibuster allowed me to have a nice FaceTime with my son. So I did get that as an extra bonus of tonight. So I appreciate that as a planning board attorney, you know, at planning boards like you all, that you make these sacrifices, but I did get to see a little extra time with my son tonight.
If you want to filibuster for about another 7 to 8 minutes, I think the consultant will be here.
I've got a couple more, and then maybe I'll go to the engineer, because the comments, Mr. Bodendorf's here, so I'll probably...
John, ETA is 8:35.
Yes, I saw that. Yep.
So John, get ready. So while our submissions to the board to date goes into a lot greater detail than I've been able to present this evening, you know, it goes through the ins and outs of our project's satisfaction with those special permit criteria. You know, we're also here to discuss the secret review. That's obviously why we're here, of what's been classified as a unlisted action. Of course, our position is that it would be type 2, so the discussion of a pos deck is somewhat ironic in the stratosphere of what would otherwise be exempt from the secret regulations. So, now that I've stolen most of Aaron's talking points, and I'm going to move him back in our presentation so that our engineer can speak, I will highlight one important point, as it seems to be underlying the review of this action that's before us all. Namely, and it's detailed in the planning consultant's memo, so I'll bring it back up, it suggests that the applicant consider moving forward with a different permitted use, air quotes, theme here. I always talk with my hands in case you couldn't tell. Slow down sometimes when we really want to hear it. Uses which are more intense than the proposal are in that use categories that we can do. And we mentioned hotels or otherwise. Even a single-family residential development, townhomes would occupy more of the space, provide less screening, would be effectively more intense, and that goes back to our traffic discussion. But the action before you this evening is not to determine whether the board likes the use. That's not the discussion. It's whether it meets the special permit criteria for the proposed use, which we submit it does. So at the end of the day, New York's highest court, our Court of Appeals, because again, we can't do anything that makes sense. You would think the Supreme Court would be our highest. It's not. The Court of Appeals tells us that where it's a special permit, it's tantamount to a permitted use in the district, as long as it complies with those criteria. And we've submitted before you a very extensive application that goes through each of those criteria and tries to articulate why this will be a great use, why it will be a low impactful use, why it will benefit the neighbors because it won't have a lot of people coming in and out of the site, why it restricts how cars come into the site, why it provides the DOT with the future to be able to connect to the Fishkill Correctional Facility if we can. And all of those details relate back to how this use is substantially similar to other uses and a plethora of other more intense uses. And we've respectfully submitted that we are a less intense and appropriate use of this site. So rather than turning to Aaron, I will now turn to our engineer just to provide an update with the materials we provided for the engineering of the site. And then maybe I'll turn to Mr. Greeley, but maybe I'll go to Aaron depending on if Liz catches her breath when she shows up. So thank you for the time to let me present this evening, and I'll turn it over now to Larry Paggi, our project engineer.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Larry. Good to see you.
It's good to see all of you.
Larry.
John, I don't know if I can talk for 7 minutes, because there really wasn't much to talk about, so...
Well, we'll probably make it repeated again. I know it always gets you.
I mean, John's comments are pretty much checklist items that we would have expected with this level of submittal. Our intention with what we submitted was to demonstrate technical viability of the site, which I think we've done. John is pointing out the future steps that we need to follow, which we're in complete agreement with. From a site civil point of view, it's a relatively easy site to develop for us. We've got lots of room to do the things that we need to do, and it allows us to take advantage of trying to make the things as attractive as possible too, which is kind of nice. Usually we find ourselves trying to fit things in with a shoehorn, and that's not the case on this parcel. The real challenge has been we've been involved kind of behind the scenes, almost from the inception of this project, has been the access to the site, and that's more Phil's bag here. As far as the physical access to the site, it's a pretty simple, straightforward design. It's a single throat access to the site, as far away as from the intersection as we can get it. There's plenty of sight distance in both directions. It would be, the movements would be restricted in and out to just right turns. Stormwater is pretty straightforward. We have the luxury of having some decent soils in the majority of the site. There are some less palatable soils at the northeast corner, but we're not proposing any development in that area, so it doesn't really impact us. I'll leave the use to the planners to talk about. John, I mean, pretty straightforward technical site.
Yeah, I think you summed it up pretty well. Just to confirm, you guys haven't done any actual soil testing out there yet?
We have not.
Okay.
We have not. What we did is we looked at the soil surveys and we...
made some assumptions.
We made some assumptions, some very conservative assumptions. So
Okay.
you may actually see some things get a little bit smaller if we get what we're expecting to get out there.
Right. So, like Mr. Paggi said, at this point, they submitted plans that are much more advanced than what we had received previously, but I would still consider it a preliminary submission, and in that regard, we didn't go crazy listing every single little item that they're going to have to address. Larry's been through this many times. He knows exactly what needs to be done. And I do agree that what they've submitted does demonstrate that this could probably work if it goes forward.
We did pretty good. We got 4 minutes. So.
Okay. Thanks. And now we'll turn to Mr. Gilly to go through the traffic materials again. These are things I think Ms. Axelson has seen and reviewed, so I think we're in good position to hopefully just sort of reiterate some of this important information, but is relevant because we are here to discuss with you all, of course, the seeker process, and these are all seeker impacts that we're mitigating or working to mitigate throughout the development of this project. So, Phil, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Philip Greeley from Colliers Engineering and Design. Taylor described some of the items that we would have relative to access, right turn in, right turn out. That was pretty much mandated by New York State DOT when we met with them several years ago in looking at what could be developed on this property. And their direction was have a use that's a low traffic generator. So that's the direction we went. In terms of traffic conditions out there today, I don't need to tell anybody what happens, especially in rush hour and when the trains come in and the traffic backs up all on 9D. We know that. We know it backs up past this site. We have the ability to, and we've made a commitment to dedicate some additional land to New York State DOT to provide a right turn lane coming northbound so that traffic turning onto the eastbound on-ramp would be able to do that. So we are in a position to help accommodate that type of improvement. It's not the main improvement, but it would lessen the queue that occurs there today. So that's part of our proposal with this application. In terms of traffic generation, again, in peak hours, we have several thousand vehicles that go through the intersection there at the ramp and 9D. This use would generate less than 10 vehicles in an hour. That's the type of peak hour traffic we're talking about. So from a traffic standpoint, we have gone with a low traffic generating use. We've made accommodations to get additional improvements to help the conditions that are there. There's also a provision for some additional lands if the state ever did other improvements along the 84 corridor, such as a service road. We control the frontage along the ramp, and we would dedicate land if that was something that the state ever pursued in the future. That, again, is something from a long-term planning perspective, but we're in a position to make that, and the plan has been designed to allow us to make that dedication. So just that's pretty much the synopsis of what we've laid out. All the technical information is in our report. We've identified the existing conditions, future conditions, and we've made these commitments to help improve the traffic by providing the land for that northbound right turn lane. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Axelson has entered the building. Welcome.
I think I can buy Ms. Axelson 1 or 2 more minutes with that. Thank you for joining us. We went through just a presentation background with respect to the uses and what's proposed, and now we have Aaron Warner from AKRF here to just provide the board with an update and summarization of some of the materials included in his narrative EAF. So for the benefit of the board, we are in again, the secret process as an unlisted action. So what we've been trying to work through with you all is effectively showing you all of the materials responsive to the draft positive declaration that had been previously circulated, and our submission was to address what were identified, and we believe to be a bit loosely identified as potentially significant adverse environmental impacts. We're not going to be doing impacts to Indiana bats, trees are not on the site, things to that effect. So all those materials we tried to respond to in a more formal supplemental narrative. And that's part of the secret process. The idea is identify impacts, and the applicant is trying to mitigate any potentially significant adverse environmental impacts. So with that, I will turn over to Aaron just to sort of lay out and summarize some of the important details that were included in his report, again, responding to Ms. Axelson's initial positive declaration draft, and of course, the comments in the initial memorandum, and then we also did receive, of course, Mr. Bodendorf and Ms. Axelson's most recent memoranda that, of course, will request an opportunity to respond to going forward. So with that, Mr. Werner.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thanks, Taylor. Yeah, my name is Aaron Werner from AKRF. We're a planning firm. I work out of the Hudson Valley office of AKRF. Yeah, so we were brought in to prepare this expanded EAF narrative. You'll find that how we structured it was we went through the Part 2 POS deck document that was drafted a few months back. How we structured it was to follow along with each one of those questions that was identified as a potential impact. The sub-questions A through E, or whatever they may be, follows along pretty closely with that document. So I feel if you want to go through your Part 2, I recommend you also take a look at this report as you read through that to see our analysis to support the no significant impacts findings. We've also included some information about the substantial similarity determination, mainly the 4 findings that the code requires. We weave that into our report and how a lot of the sections of this report tie into that. Right, a less intense use as far as parking, traffic generation, water usage, overall disturbance to the site. It's all in there. I think we've developed a pretty fair record in response to the board's deliberations to date. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have tonight.
Yeah, well, so, thank you, and again, welcome, Liz. I think maybe what we'll do now, I don't know, John, do you want to go through any more of your engineering memo, or do you think that it kind of speaks for itself in terms of, I think you do talk about the lack of certain materials that would make a complete site plan submission, and Liz also mentioned those in her memo. But if there's anything else you want to highlight before we move on, engineering-wise?
No, I don't really see the point of doing that at this point, given the state of the submission, so.
Okay. So I think what I wanted to do, Liz prepared a very good, I guess, 4 or 5 page memo. If you've had a chance to catch your breath from your trip from your other meeting,
I'm here.
maybe we could ask you to go through your memo.
Okay.
And then I think I'd also like to see if the board would consider starting to go through in a little bit more detail the Part 2 draft of the EAF and perhaps even the draft neg deck that you had prepared.
Pause deck.
Yeah. We had gone through it a little bit in December, but not very much. So that might be something we want to try to get to. And again, certainly give the applicant a chance to participate in the discussion. So.
You want me to go ahead?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and at least start telling us about your memo.
Okay, all right. So I did review the materials, and I could see how they were intended to follow along, with some of the areas of impact. I guess the thing that I kind of go back to that I felt like I was missing in here was an acknowledgement of the town's zoning. And because I'm involved in comprehensive plan right now, I'm a lot more aware of the 2009 comprehensive plan on which the town's zoning is substantially based. And there really is a logic to how the zoning districts are laid out, kind of in order of intensity. So I wanted to go back through that so that the board is aware of it. So in my comment 3, I'm walking you through some of the very basic parts of the purposes of the code and also district intent. The district intent for RB is intended to include residential uses in non-residential zone with limited business, institutional, and recreational uses, which are appropriate adjacent to residential areas. And also, I can't help but stop and step back and look at this site, having seen lots of communities where there's kind of a core area, and wrapped around it are residential areas. But in a residential area where you have an entryway to 2 different communities, both Fishkill and Beacon, you need some basic services there. And I think that had to be what the comprehensive plan had in mind and the zoning had in mind when this became restricted business, was to nestle something that fit right there. So I went through, of course, to try to look at all the different uses that are allowed, because there are so many options in the restricted business zoning district. It's actually pretty amazing, and I'm not going to read through all of them, but there are a number of non-residential uses. But the very first use that's listed is any use permitted in the R15 residence district, and I'll come back to that later. And then motels, hotels, resorts, recreation and cultural activities, restaurants and other places of food, etc. Professional offices, including medical and dental, congregate care facilities. And I also am aware that there was the one argument that sounded like it stuck in terms of doing storage here was the lower level of traffic for storage. But when I went back through all of the traffic information, I found an older traffic study in 2018 where they did show hotel without a restaurant. And the traffic for that was comparable to some of the lower traffic generators that have been presented in a lot of this information. So, but most importantly, before I go down to that comment, I think traffic is one consideration for any kind of land development in any zoning district, and that whatever traffic impacts there are typically are mitigated by improvements, access way, maybe some off-site road improvement, but unless it's very severe, I think it's pretty unusual to have a use eliminated simply based on a desired lower traffic volume. So I don't think that that lower traffic volume kind of pushes aside all the potential uses here that I think could fit in this part of the community. And then in the R15 district, there are even more uses, and some of these could be lower traffic one, if that's an important criteria. But I think the planning board would want to look at the zoning district, look at the uses that are permitted, think about the character of the area, and think about what are some possible uses that might fit nicely in that sort of neighborhood area. It is a mixed-use neighborhood, but there is a huge swath of pretty concentrated neighborhood areas south of the site. And then when you go north of I-84, there's a mixture of smaller neighborhood areas, apartment complexes. I think there's a senior care facility. And then there are some small businesses right on the roadway, which kind of makes sense. Those businesses complement the other nearby things. So anyway, the R15 zone also offers a number of uses that could work on this site and generate some income on the site, and could be, you know, tourist homes or boarding houses. There's a designed multiple use development use that's possible here. That could also work with maybe some small offices or businesses on the ground floor and apartments on top. I'm sure the board is aware that the Fishkill and Beacon areas become a pretty strong tourist area for either people coming upstate for the weekend. I'm sure you have a strong market for second homes and rentals, Airbnbs, even though that may be a sensitive topic. And at least coming from Ulster County, I know that when I cross the bridge, the Newburgh-Beacon Bridge, and I'm heading even just to the train station, I always look at that turn, that right turn that you make as basically the entrance to that area. So I think even though it looks perhaps to someone who doesn't know the area very well as an area that could take a sort of what's the word I want? A less engaging business use. But I think this site has the possibility of accommodating a very community-oriented business use, whether it be hotel, restaurant, etc. So that's the main thing I found missing was that I didn't find any compelling rationale presented yet that leads me to believe that somehow a use that isn't permitted here, the storage use, is a better use than the complement of, what do we have? I think we have nearly a dozen possible uses for the site. So that's the big nugget, and I don't know if you want me to go on, or does anybody have questions so far, or comments?
Go on.
No, yeah.
Keep going.
Okay, okay. Wow. Let's see.
Not to interrupt you, Ms. Axelson, but just for the board's,
Sure.
would you like us to respond per sections, or do you want us to sort of provide
No,
feedback
I
at the
think,
end?
why don't we let Liz go through the memo, and then we'll have a discussion.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah. Okay. So anyway, again, traffic is just one aspect of the board's decision-making process. And I think because this pertains to use, the character of the area and the needs of the surrounding area are really much more important than just simply one aspect of that. I know in our last comment, we had asked for the full EAF to be completely filled out, so that would be good. And I think the plans are still somewhat incomplete. I think they're quite incomplete. I can understand on some level why that's occurred, because the use hasn't yet been settled upon. But I'm still not finding that rationale. I didn't find an extensive analysis of the existing site and surrounding zoning and land use. I'll just give you one example of that. One of the things that I've noticed in kind of poking around that area is that that very dense neighborhood that's immediately south of the site has public water and public sewer, more importantly. So the site should be able to hook into those things, which definitely increases the capacity of the site to be more of a community-oriented or tourist-oriented business. Let's see. All right. I think you need to acknowledge a little bit more, in more detail, about how extensively residential this area is around here. I know that might seem like an argument for storage, but I also think it speaks to the kinds of services that people that live in the area or visit the area might need. I'm on page 4. There may be a wetland on the site, and I think at this point, it wouldn't hurt to have a wetland delineator take a look at that and just weigh in one way or another. If there's really no wetland there, they should be able to generate a report quickly to, put that issue to rest or indicate whether it's there and how it would be avoided. Let's see. Both the Hudson Cultural Services and I generated a soils map, and there was an issue with that. So the hydrological report, I don't know how much it's based on that, because that's really an engineering review, which probably doesn't make sense to read at this point, but the soils map is a little off. It's got an extra lobe of land, so that should be corrected so that can be considered. Let's see. And noting again that there is the availability of public water and sewer, so I don't think you really need to show well and septic. I thought what was really lacking was more of a discussion about aesthetic resources. It seemed to be a lot of the text seemed to be diminishing the aesthetic and aspects and the character of that area. And, I could see how if you're not used to this area, you might look and just say, oh, this is just a highway next to a highway after a bridge. But if you're really spending any time in this area at all, what you're going to see is there are people walking back and forth across Newburgh Beacon Bridge. It's a beautiful walkway. One of the aesthetic appeals is the Hudson River. You might not be able to see the Hudson River from this site, but the sidewalks on both sides of the road and that walkway are all related to the proximity of this area to the Hudson River and to all the amenities that go along with it, all the trails that interconnect in this area, and also just because Fishkill has a lot of little business areas, and Beacon also, that attract people to travel even just to take day trips, where they're here staying in a hotel and they want to go find some place to eat or shop. So I think rather than diminishing the value of that area, to try to recognize that a little bit more. And on the historical and archaeological, I did read through the report and the conclusions. I just have to say, when I first started reviewing this, I kept finding Google Earth street views of the structure that was there. And I'm not really sure why it was taken down, but it was kind of a beautiful old house. I know it's gone, I understand that, but that was the kind of amenity that has been here in this community, and that, I look at something like that and think, well, that could have been fixed into a really nice, whatever, bed and breakfast or something like that. So I do acknowledge that it sounds like Hudson Cultural Services is saying that there isn't any further study to be done, but I do know that she would, or her staff would, submit that to the Cultural Resource Information System, and we would want to find out what their response is, because having represented applicants myself, I know that sometimes you get a response that might ask you to look at something else, or to give the sign-off. Let's see. And then basically, when I got down to talking about, my comments got a little repetitive at the end of my memorandum, because on the issues of traffic, consistency with community plans, and consistency with community character, I'm basically referring the board and the applicant back to the whole logic of the permitted principal and special use permit uses, which I present early on, and which I know that if you read those sections and find them, it just seems to be a built-in argument for why this use doesn't make sense on this site, or why this use shouldn't be in one of the 3 zoning districts that does permit storage in this community. So I'm not getting any compelling arguments yet, and I really strongly urge the applicant to take a look at some of these other uses, because they could bring a decent return on the property. They may be higher and better uses for this property than the storage facility that's proposed.
Well, from a seeker standpoint, I can't really speak on what you just said, because I was brought on to analyze this project as proposed, a site plan, special use permit application. Do you want to?
I think anecdotally, thank you, Ms. Axelson, for that. I just, you didn't have the benefit of my presentation. I will submit for the record of my comments. Obviously, it'll be part of the minutes, and so on and so forth. We did try to provide some background. For the benefit of the board, I'm quite familiar with the City of Beacon. My wife and I got married at the Roundhouse. I've been responsible personally for most of the projects that have been approved in the City of Beacon for the last 10 years. So I've appeared in connection with what the traffic concerns are, so I'm very familiar with it coming off the highway, whether you're coming from Newburgh, on the waterfront, or elsewhere on Liberty Street, coming across and feeling this area. So personally, and I know the applicant, who owns a number of businesses in the City of Beacon, is very familiar with this area and knows this property well. Certainly considered other uses. This is not the original intended application. The applicant did come, initially have discussions with the New York State DOT about a hotel and other uses that are permitted as of right. We respectfully disagree with Ms. Axelson's characterization as we presented in our application that this is not a permitted use. We're seeking a special permit, which again is tantamount to a permitted use, as long as the use satisfies the criteria. It's not a matter of what we want on the site, it's a matter of whether it satisfies those criteria. So that's what the applicant has submitted, is an application for a use that's low in traffic impacts. In fact, the comprehensive plan that Ms. Axelson referred to specifically calls for uses that are low traffic generators, businesses that are low traffic generators. So this is conformance not only with the comprehensive plan, but with the character of the area. It was said this evening that there could be an argument for storage as being a low impact use to neighbors, and that's what we're considering. You'll recall, we have 3 big, loud neighbors, 84, 9, on 3 sides. Whatever happens with the correctional facility in the future, sorry, as I poke Aaron in the eye, we have, love my gesticulations, we have a future that's in mind. This application goes beyond what could be more intense uses that would impact the neighborhood and proposes a low-impact, beautiful beacon-like building using beacon brick, and again, being on this side of the highway. We know we're in the town. We're not before the City of Beacon Planning Board right now. We're before your original 9 towns in Dutchess County Planning Board, and that's what we're reviewing. It's an application consistent with your criteria. This use was included in your zoning code to say, if it meets these criteria, it would be permitted on the site. So respectfully, we have considered, and Aaron's report evaluates those other uses in the context. Essentially, we provided what, if you did POSDEC this project, would be an alternatives analysis. That's really the only additional information you'd get out of a POSDEC. The details that we're providing to you are to allow you to effectively review conclusively with lots of detail and support why this application will not have a significant adverse environmental impact for all the reasons. Traffic, water is highlighted that there's access to, and a number of other reasons. We're not trying to affect the pedestrian corridor. In fact, we're providing the DOT with lands that they can use to do all those types of improvements should they see fit. We don't know if DOT is going to widen or put a turn lane in. We don't know, but we've spoken with the DOT and we've tried to make these things a reality. We understand, and I expect the folks behind us this evening are neighbors in the area, but we're familiar with the development that's taking place in both the town and the city. And this project is trying to reflect that we are indeed next to a highway. I don't know if we drive up 84, the first residential uses you're going to see are past the Fishkill, the Fishkill prison on the right-hand side if we're headed eastbound. Across the way there, we have a congregate care facility because it's highlighted. There are only 4 limited areas in the town at all that are zoned in the RB district. We've included a lot of these materials in our prior submissions that are helpful to understand it. But Ms. Axelson highlighted that a self-storage facility shouldn't be something that's located necessarily near residential uses. And I'm not meaning to put words in your mouth, so if I'm misstating, I'm just saying that the storage facility that's proposed, 3 neighbors, DOT, heavy intense, thousands of vehicles a day going by the site. Not exactly an ideal location for single-family residential homes or a number of the other uses. The traffic itself, limited to right in, right out, that limits the other uses as well. The future of your correctional facility shared with the city of Beacon and those facilities are another component altogether. But what's important to consider is what Ms. Axelson also noted, which is that the other districts that do presently permit, just again as a permitted use or a special permit use, they allow, these storage facilities are allowed in other districts in your town. What we did and submitted in our prior applications, and I'm looking at a letter from February of 2022, so again, part of our anniversary theme, and in this area of the town that's classified RB, the other districts that allow them, there's GB and PI districts where they're permitted. And these are generally properties that are classified, again, near residential uses. You go right across the bridge, there's a self-storage facility, immediate next to it is a house. All you have to do is drive over the highway, and you can see it, I think it's called 9D self-storage, right there on the right. This use is not going to look like a self-storage facility. As we mentioned, the architect who's done all of these new buildings, or restored all the factory buildings, the one that did the roundhouse where I got married and watched out those big windows and saw a repurposed factory building, is designing this building because it's designed to fit the character of this neighborhood and be a much more low-intensity, low-impact use that meets all these criteria. So respectfully, we disagree that we should be looking at all of these other uses. We have. We've evaluated this use as being what hopefully the neighborhood would support as a low-impact use, because again, not having a use period is not what property is for, and this district is a commercial district. This use, we think, is overlooked and is consistent with the other districts where this use is permitted, and also consistent with, on our one side, the residential neighborhood, and it's designed visually to help benefit that and be something that set back, screened, and isn't, something more than, hey, I wonder what that factory might have been one point, and that's what Beacon has done a lot of, and the town has done some of that too. So it's, as it's on the, if we're going to call it Beacon side, we're here in the town of Fishkill, and we're here to try and make this fit with your town and the criteria that you have before us. So with that, Aaron, I know you had some other points to Ms. Axelson's memo.
Just, a couple of things. I mean, some uses that you rattled off too, or just, to me, and just in looking at this project, this is an 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. operation. Restaurants and hotels are open a lot later than that. A lot more traffic, obviously. So, and for the aesthetic resources analysis, we did look at an area about a half a mile from the site. We did site sections, north and south, east and west. We do show that relationship between the 90 sidewalk and the site. There is a 200-foot setback between 90 and the building. There'll be landscaping between it. As far as 84, a site section from 84 through the site, there's a significant grade change there where you're going to be looking up at trees and not seeing this 2-story building from 84. all of that's been documented in our report, so I think, we feel like we've done a pretty good record on the aesthetics. We also looked at it through the DEC's standards. We have a lot of references to the EAF workbooks, which you're required to go through as you go through a Part 2. So again, we respectfully disagree with some of those findings.
And while I may not be a sound consultant, one of the projects that we're currently involved in the city of Beacon is renovating a 200-year-old church for an event space and a hotel. Reason why I bring that up is because the buildings that are being built on the site will actually add noise buffering for some of the residential neighborhood that's there. This building will be between the highway and the residential uses, where presently today there is not. So I'm not saying that that's, whatever the use is, that something on the site will actually have other benefits, unintended or otherwise, that might otherwise inure to the benefit of the community. So we're trying to be low impact, we're trying to be supportive and consistent with the character, but we're not trying to develop or overdevelop the site. In fact, we're trying to reduce the envelope, preserve as much open space, provide future opportunity for the correctional facility or any access thereof, whether it's a service road or otherwise. The ability, as Ms. Axelson pointed out, for other viewpoints that might be available to the Hudson River, albeit I know a couple other projects that are being done right down the street that will have quite a bit better views of the Hudson that are greenway trails and other things that the city has worked into the network that Ms. Axelson mentioned. So there's a lot of great things in the area, and this site, intended to be a passive, low-intensity use, is fully consistent with what the RB really looks for, not a intense use. It really doesn't make sense that the hotel is even a consideration when the reality of it is the comp plan is calling for these low vehicle traffic uses.
I was a little curious about the passive use, that I didn't really understand what was meant by that. And when I looked it up, it made it sound like it was a kind of a passive income. In other words, it's a place that has, it's a building and parking and maybe one employee, so it doesn't perhaps require a certain level of investment or staffing. Kind of, I don't know if it's a passive income thing. I guess that's the part about this particular use of all the uses that are listed in the RB district, which all seem to be much more community-oriented and offering something for people to come to. And this just seems like, I don't know, I can't explain it. And not as community-oriented and sort of stayed and dry for this area. And I know that you mentioned 3 homes that are maybe bordering the site, but to the south of the site is a huge neighborhood area. Yes. So it is a very, very residential area.
Please, no discussion back there.
Yeah, and there is a way of doing there are a number of those other uses that maybe the traffic is a little bit more than storage, but those uses aren't hugely more traffic. And again, traffic isn't the huge criteria here. If the board, if somebody came in with one of the uses that were allowed, of course they would look at traffic, but there would be a way to address it. But they're going to look at numerous factors of a use and how it fits here and how it complements the area around, and honestly, how it addresses zoning. This is such an exception, especially given that it could be in 3 other zoning districts. Like, there is a place for storage, and it is in, a lot of those areas are more business-oriented, with the higher intensity business. So it just seems like, I just can't understand why the community would want to have a use like this here at sort of an entryway that just isn't oriented to the community or providing those kinds of services or connection or care or whatever it is that all the other uses have. So I guess, again, I'll go back through and read, but the other thing that the town should be concerned with, and maybe I shouldn't say this, maybe this is more of a legal question, that, the town should be concerned with, and maybe I shouldn't say this, maybe this is more of a legal question, that, the town should be concerned with, and maybe I shouldn't say this, maybe this is more of a legal question, that, the town should be concerned with, and maybe I shouldn't say this, maybe this is more of a legal question, that, the town should be concerned with, and maybe I shouldn't say this, maybe this is more of a legal question, that, the town should be concerned with, and maybe I shouldn't say this, maybe this is more of a legal question, that, the town should be concerned with, and maybe I shouldn't say this, maybe this is more of a legal question, that, the town should be concerned with, and maybe I shouldn't say this, maybe this is more of a legal question, that, the town should be concerned with, and maybe I shouldn't say this, maybe this is more of a legal question, that, the town should be concerned with, and maybe I shouldn't say this, maybe this is more of a legal question, that, the town should be concerned with, and maybe I shouldn't say this, maybe this is more of a I know in other communities that I work in, there is a big push for storage in many places because it is the kind of a use that can be put on a site with a certain level of cost. It also allows a footprint to be established on a business site, and it is a use that does bring in some income over time for the owner and operator. But there does seem to be a bit of a glut of storage in various communities that I've worked in, where they're seeing a lot of these applications. And I guess that, to me, is even more reason why, if there is some demand for storage, why it makes more sense to have it be located in areas where it is permitted. And I guess the other concern is, if this is allowed to be here, even though it's not listed in the more than a dozen uses permitted here, does it set any kind of precedent, for someone else to come in and want to, in a zone like this, and come up with a use that isn't permitted and make arguments, and ultimately, does it create that kind of an effect? I don't know if I should even be raising that or not, but I think it's worth it to think about, because it is very much up to the board to really think through how they feel about how this fits or doesn't, and whether it would be better to find something that is already allowed here. And I don't think it's impossible either. I think there are plenty of other income-generating uses that are allowed in the zoning district that could fit here, and it would be nicer to have a closer look. And again, I will take a look back at the materials you submitted again, but I'm not feeling convinced at this point.
One thing I'll just take some exception to, that you had indicated before, that the self-storage use is, I think in your words, a special use permit use allowed. Well, it's not currently allowed as a special use permit use in the zoning. There is this provision 150-19B, which gives the planning board discretionary authority to make a determination whether uses that are not allowed currently in the zoning should be allowed by making findings regarding similarity to other uses permitted in the zone, and then also by meeting the additional criteria that are listed in that section of the code, which go beyond, in many ways, the normal special use permit criteria for special permit uses that are allowed in the zone. So I don't think it's fair to try to characterize or represent that this should be considered by the board to be a special use permitted use that simply has to meet special use permit criteria. It goes beyond that, and until and unless the board does make a finding regarding the use, it's not allowed in the RB zone. And so I think that's one of the big issues that I think Liz has been trying to emphasize in her reviews, but the board has also had previous discussions about the use itself. And we really can't make a determination about the use until the seeker process has been completed. That's been the advice of our attorney, and that's also why I think the board is strongly considering the possibility of issuing a pause deck in order to help us make those decisions. So anyway, I thought that needed to be clarified.
Appreciate that feedback, and I know Aaron's going to jump in on this one, but just from a special permit standard, and then of course I'll stop stealing his talking points and let him, again, I'm the one that gets paid by the word, so, but with respect to the special permit use, it's your criteria. So the use, again, is not about whether it should or shouldn't be, or you like it or you don't. It's the criteria, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman. Those are the criteria that's considered, and I believe that memorandum went to a good bit of detail about considering, and as was presented this evening, what other uses might we consider instead? And that's not the action that's before your board, but I can let Aaron, I think, speak to the seeker review process and what the formal review process is, that where our expanded EAF gets into all of these criteria, right? All the things that you are considering from a seeker process without necessarily the need of a positive declaration to do just that.
Right, I mean, this has been prepared to kind of go hand in hand with that Part 2 that was drafted. It's responding to the concerns that were raised in that Part 2. The POSDEC draft also mentioned in several places little or no information has been provided about the plan and disturbance, and that's all been provided at this point in this report and a lot of what Larry Page's documents have shown. We have some numbers now about disturbance. We have numbers about grading, water usage, the plan itself. So I think that's a little inaccurate to have a document that says little or no information. We have a project here where we're providing you with the facts and the information about it in our assessment of the impacts. So, like I said, I feel it's an expanded EAF process could help the board get through the seeker process in a good way. And you can, throughout that process, you can make changes, right? Adjustments can be made to the plan, additional screening, and other mitigating factors that can be built into the project. That's how seeker works. It's seeker doing its job. And in this case, we're providing you with the assessment up front rather than POSDECing and then probably receiving the same information repackaged in an EIS, which might not make sense.
Well, the only, at this point, if the board wants me to, I can go back and look through the submittal in more detail. I know there are some more issues that need to be addressed, so the alternative would be to wait for the next submittal and do the review at that time.
Yeah, one thing that I think we need to mention is that there are a number of technical submission requirements that would need to be received by the board before we can make a formal referral to the county planning department for their GML referral review. And in our past experience, and as well stated by the county, they will basically reject and send back an incomplete submission, and they have some fairly specific things that they need to see, which have also been indicated by both of our consultants from CPL that are not provided yet and would need to be provided before we get the county's review. So I think the county review certainly can be helpful to the board in making some decisions, but it seems like we're kind of at a standstill in terms of the applicant not wanting to prepare more detailed plan submissions where the use issue hasn't been decided yet, and the planning board making a decision about how to proceed with the seeker determination at some point. We may or may not be ready to do that yet, but fairly soon we will need to be at that point. So I think we've discussed this before, where a POSDEC and a requirement for an environmental impact statement can cover many of the things that might not be able to be provided today in detail, but could be provided during the environmental impact statement process. And if in fact there are one or more potentially significant adverse environmental impacts and issues, and of course the applicant has a different viewpoint of that from what the board's viewpoint may or may not be at this point, we will soon find out about that. And that's where we will have to go through in quite a bit of detail the Part 2 draft and a draft POSDEC. But I'm not sure how far we're going to get by simply going back and forth with discussions at this point.
And if I may, just to chime in, one note, Mr. Chairman, and I will refer to the board's counsel with respect to general municipal law 239 and the referral process. We're not at the public hearing. or in that process, we're certainly not concerned, or we'd be welcome a submission in circulation, and it can be circulated more than once to the county, as you mentioned, for going back for additional comments. But we have not said that we will not provide more information. In fact, we hired a planner and a cultural resources consultant to prepare supplemental submissions to directly address the information. So I think what might be beneficial, Mr. Chairman, if you see fit, would be if there is specific areas that the board has explicit concern. I know your consultant has highlighted, some of those areas, but if there are specific areas that might trigger and that's part of what the Part 2 will do when we're there, but are there specific items that are of principal concern with respect to significant adverse environmental impacts? We'd be interested to know those items.
Right, and just so you know, this document was prepared to cover everything in the Part 2 that was either no or small impact or moderate to large. We cover every single one where that was checked off, either one. Obviously, anything that was checked no at the top of the topic was not covered because it seems like that's not relevant. And yeah, to issue a positive declaration, you have to identify at least one. I'm not trying to advise you. You have counsel and a planner here that work for you, but you have to identify just one significant adverse impact. And I think what we've submitted here, going through that Part 2 line by line, essentially doesn't show there is one. Obviously, you can read that and give us comments, but we need to know what that impact is, and that would support a POSDEC.
Yep, and we will certainly need to discuss that as a board. I personally have gone through your cut at a Part 2 and a draft neg deck, so to speak, and I disagree with a lot of your findings, or draft findings, because they're not findings at all. In fact, it's the board only that can and has to make findings and determinations. It's helpful, to have that as another point of view, but again, I think what we're going to need to do, and whether we do that tonight or not, I'll leave to the board's discretion, and then I'll ask for our consultant's advice on whether we get into a detailed review of our draft Part 2 EAF and draft POSDEC.
You mean to sit and go through it tonight?
Yeah, that's the question. Because if we...
Is that something the board wants to do?
That's my question to the board.
I mean, I don't, honestly, I feel like we need some more information, and based on some of the points that have been made tonight, I'll go back and take a second look at things, see if I missed anything. But I don't, I'm not, there wasn't anything in this submittal that moved the needle over for me of not proceeding with a POSDEC ultimately. I guess I was just hoping for, a little bit more recognition of the effect of uses on the community other than the one that the applicant is proposing. That's my biggest concern, is I don't find a well-rounded look at that. And I know that I don't know, I'm not recommending that you do a POSDEC or go over the Part 2 tonight. I don't see any point in doing that at
One
this
more thought.
point.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's nothing in your code in that section about substantial similarity that says, in determining this, you have to do an environmental review that looks at all possibilities and do a generic style environmental review. That it's not in there. That's why it's actually against seeker in a lot of ways. That's why this EAF focuses on this use. And the substantial similarity determination, in my view, and I think in Taylor's as well, is that it comes prior to analyzing the project that is before you.
Mr. Chairman, I actually have to jump into that because
Thank you.
that is something that I think is plainly in conflict with the provisions of the code. Section 150-19B, it's a small, it's actually number 1, then D, and it says that this is a finding that the planning board must ultimately make prior to approval. This is one of 4 findings that the board must make. The proposed use shall share characteristics in common with and not be of greater intensity, density, or generate more environmental impact, including but not limited to have no greater adverse effects upon traffic, noise, air quality, parking, or any other reasonably relevant attribute than those uses listed in the zoning district. And that goes exactly, I think, central to this issue, which is how does the board make this determination without having all of the environmental review completed to the satisfaction of the board, where all identified relevant environmental areas have been evaluated, have been, a hard look has been taken at all of them, and appropriate mitigation, if necessary, has been provided. And this is a finding that the board has to make, and you have to have a record in order to be able to make that finding.
And I think just to play off the comments from the planning board attorney, which we appreciate, we are providing that material. Again, our submission to you was an expanded EAF. It wasn't a written document just sort of in a stratosphere. It was designed to respond directly to those secret criteria, and that's what we're analyzing. The board has made that classification. While we respectfully disagree that a determination, one that typically is administrative determination solely of a building inspector, which would be exempt from seeker, the board has classified this as an unlisted action, so we've prepared these materials to address it. And as Aaron has highlighted, our submissions to you and our materials are designed to respond to all those seeker requirements. We're not skirting any, we're not ignoring any. In fact, we're diving very deeply into it on what would typically be an unlisted, uncoordinated review, and a pretty, again, depending on the nature of the site, always things can change, but we're not trying to avoid any of those things. Instead, we hear you, and we're trying to be responsive to those comments because we're trying to make a use that we believe to be substantially similar and otherwise satisfies these criteria. So we appreciate that and that clarification, but we're trying to provide that for you here, and we think that we can do that through these materials. So I think if Ms. Axelson might reconsider looking at the POS deck that was drafted, there might be things that are now changed.
I wasn't going to look at the POS deck again. What I was going to do is go back through the materials and take a look at them. And look at the criteria. But again, my impression was that all of the arguments about the criteria were just solely based on the proposed use. And I understand what you're saying about that, but I didn't get any sense from any of the material that there were any uses allowed that the applicant would even consider, that it is just, this is what I want to do on this site, and I'm going to make it fit here. I'm going to pigeonhole this use here, and I'm going to, put together all this rationale, and it just doesn't do the trick in terms of would I recommend to this board that they allow this use to go forward here, given the numerous other possibilities that could be here that would fit on this site, and the facilities are there for this site, and the surrounding community is there for this site. I mean, I guess I want to go back and look at that again and see. The only reason I'm asking the board is whether or not they want to assign me to take another look at it, or whether the board would like me to wait until there's another submittal to address the comments that I've issued here, and then consider that then, which is the board's typical practice. I've looked at a submittal, it was provided, I've issued my comments, and then typically the applicant's folks would go ahead and prepare a response to that.
I would offer another suggestion as well, in addition to those options that Liz has laid out, is another option would be if the board is satisfied that there are the potential for at least one significant environmental impact, then the board would and could be in a position to adopt a positive declaration for the project.
I would just add anecdotally, and this is more to Ms. Axelson's comments, but the details that have been described as far as the applicant looking into other uses, the applicant has looked into other uses that are higher traffic generators and otherwise more active uses, restaurants, people eating dinner, sitting outside, noise, things of that effect, unlike the passive use that's proposed. But what the description that you heard, and this is my reading of it as a land use and zoning attorney who appears before zoning boards quite regularly, is more tantamount to a use variance consideration, where you're looking at there are no other economically viable uses. That's not what we're doing here. That's not the exercise. That's not what your criteria calls for. So that exercise is one of value, if we were at the zoning board seeking a use variance for this use, that there were no other economically viable use, but the applicant has considered those uses and has incorporated into their submission, traffic being just one of those reasons. So I just want to sort of highlight, we're not here for a use variance, we are here for a special permit for the use consistent with what the code calls for. But we'd have certainly no objection to providing a supplemental submission further addressing these materials if that would benefit Ms. Axelson's further review. And, of course, the board's consideration of our uses.
Yeah, I think we should get the full board's input on this, but I think my impression is that we should not ask Liz to do more work.
Okay.
And, I think in your memo, you basically indicate a lot of things that do need to be responded to in one way or another, materials that should be submitted, issues that have not been adequately addressed. I mean, just from our previous discussions at previous board meetings, I jotted down some things that, in my own mind, probably could trigger a POSDEC tonight. Traffic access and circulation, dangerous access on Route 90 at the I-84 interchange, vehicles desiring to access the site southbound on 9D would have to turn into a neighborhood road, perhaps like Van Ness Road, and make a U-turn to go back and enter northbound on 9D. Potential impacts on character of adjacent residential neighborhood, including impacts of, in addition to the traffic, lighting, noise, and those vehicles turning around to get to the site. Inconsistent with comprehensive plan. Use is not permitted in the RB zone unless it's determined to meet certain of these criteria in section 150-19. Potential for controversy is evidenced by informal public comments that were received from residents of the area. And in addition, we have some comments about the site development plan set being incomplete with further information needed. So I think we need to be in a position to make a decision soon. I think I would give the applicant one more chance to make submissions based on the comments by our engineer and planner, not to spend more time on our end reviewing it until we get that information. But I think, as our attorney has said, we could make a determination at this point, based on our previous discussions, issuing a POSDEC, as I've just outlined some of the issues here, which I don't think have been adequately addressed at all.
I think if you were going to consider the POSDEC, it would be the one that's already drafted. I don't think we would sit here and try to change it now. It just seems a little premature.
No,
at this point.
I'm just saying, if we were so inclined, I think we have the information we need or don't have. And oftentimes, environmental impact statements are required without full, complete submissions. Again, seeker tells us to make a determination of significance as early in the process as possible, based on having necessary information for a neg deck. But for a POSDEC, if there are one or more potential environmental adverse impacts that the board feels have to be analyzed through an environmental impact statement, that could happen sooner rather than later. That's my point.
I would just add one caveat for the benefit of the board, and certainly can defer to your counsel or your consultants, but of course, those substantial impacts aren't just that there could be, it should consider if they are mitigated, and if they're mitigated sufficiently to mitigate against the potential for a significant adverse environmental impact.
And that's exactly what an environmental impact statement can be about, is mitigation measures, alternatives, and any number of other things that we need to rely on seeker for.
Absolutely, as too can an expanded EAF, respectfully.
And we've done many expanded EAFs, some of which have taken 5 years to complete because there's a lot of back and forth. In my opinion, there's nothing wrong for an applicant to pursue an approval through an environmental impact statement, and sometimes it's more efficient and effective than an expanded EAF, and it also allows better involvement by the public. So, just for your consideration.
Thank you.
In fact, I've seen applicants in other communities that I've worked in, because I'm a retired professional planner working in this field, where applicants have come to realize that perhaps a POS deck and an environmental impact statement is, in fact, a better way to go, and have actually stepped forward and volunteered to do that. Just for consideration. So I guess we're done for tonight then, right? Board? Any board member comments?
Yes.
I mean, it just seems like we aren't getting very far tonight, but if you have any suggestions or ideas or comments, please.
I do have a couple questions and comments, I guess. So when we're going through determining significance, is it the same path that we would take on either POS or neg deck? Yes or no? Dominic?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Okay, so, because every time we've gone through an application and we've gotten to a determination of significance, we've gone through a certain process. And it seems like this time we're like off the rails a bit. It doesn't seem like we're going through the normal way we would like normally before we do a neg deck, we always have a public hearing. We haven't even thought about scheduling a public hearing. I think public input's important. When I look at the secret cookbook, it has public input as one of the criteria that we should be looking at. So I know we had informal comments. I know we have the public here. I think that's another thing when we're trying to do this. We're doing all this work. I know you're doing a great job. You guys are trying to do whatever you can to show us how you can mitigate the problems there. But I would love to hear from the public also, to hear that maybe there are things there that they live there. They know stuff that we'll never know. That maybe that might be something that might be helpful in this process.
That's one of the things that an environmental impact statement can do.
I understand that, but I'm wondering if, because when I look at the cookbook and I look at, it seems like this would be a step that we take to a determination of significance, because the applicant has kind of made a argument that if we are going to go to a POS deck, we should be able to also make a decision on a neg deck. And that was the argument kind of that was been made.
Right.
You know?
I don't think that's correct.
No?
Well, don't look at the applicant.
I'm asking, that's the applicant.
I think what I heard was that the information that the applicant's consultants have put together, they feel has a certain amount of information that could also be put into an environmental impact statement. And the thing that could happen with a POS deck is it's still going to deal with all the areas of impact and talk about all those areas of impact. But you can do a scoping outline that's narrowly focused on a few key issues, and stop me if I'm going astray.
No, you're correct, but, you know, the thing about scoping and the thing about the POS deck is that it actually provides more opportunity for public input. So the process would be that the public would be able to comment on the scope of the environmental review. They have their own perspectives on what are impacts to that neighborhood and what should be evaluated. They have an opportunity for a public hearing on the scope, so at the beginning of the process. And then once all the plans are developed, then they have an opportunity for a second public hearing. And then, of course, all of their substantive comments have to be addressed in a final environmental impact statement. So there's really a much deeper and, engagement with the public in that process. To your point, Felix, that, that the public is here and obviously concerned regarding the project, and oftentimes the board has public hearings before entertaining a negative declaration. That's done, in my opinion, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but only once an application has reached a point where it's complete and it has addressed all of the comments of the board and has submitted all of the various different items. This particular applicant has made a substantial showing, in their opinion, of various different elements of this, but has not prepared fully engineered plans at this point because they're hesitant to do so, not knowing whether or not the project is going to move forward. So there is a bit of a stalemate as far as that's concerned.
Yeah.
And I think one of the main reasons for that is because this is unique in terms of what we have reviewed because of this section 150-19, which gives the planning board the discretion to say whether the use shall be permitted or not based on the criteria in that section. And I don't believe we've ever done one of those before.
No, we've never.
And it's actually a fairly new provision in the code, recent, like 2 or 3 years old.
And that's, I guess, part of my kind of confusion here as to where we're at, because this is something that is new to this board and new to us, in going in this direction. Okay. Anybody else?
Again, I'm being confused. It sounds like our consultant is saying it doesn't meet the criteria to go forward
We don't,
as
we,
a special.
Right.
All right?
I mean, I don't know, just to
And
clarify,
the applicant disagrees, which of course they're going to do, and I don't know where we go from that point.
Well, actually, I don't think the characterization of Liz's comments indicates that the criteria for the use haven't been met yet. It's that there hasn't been enough submitted to allow the planning board to make that determination.
Okay, so based on that, let's ask the applicant to please present more information to our planning,
Well, to what, to the board?
or to the board, to determine that.
I think that's,
Sounds like we're going around in circles.
well, we are, and that's,
And let's get out
That's
from the
my-
circle and either say, guys, go give us more information, all right? And let's go from there.
thank you.
Because I can't make a decision at this point in time.
Hi, Larry.
Larry?
I've been listening to some of the comments about the plans not being prepared in detail. I mean, my perspective of the plans that have been submitted is that it's really, that the technical items that remain are really kind of dotting i's and crossing t's. I don't know that, the things that John has asked for in his letter are something that's required in order to make a secret determination. I mean, a SWIP is an administrative item. We've done the drainage calculations. The designs are on the plan. If you need us to submit those detailed calculations for John to review, we can do that, I guess. I'm not quite sure I understand, Dominic, your comment about the engineering.
But, I mean, those are typically items that would be included for public comment, for a public hearing. So one of the paths forward, if we could have a fourth path forward, would be, to get to a point where the board's consultants advise the board that, all technical comments have been addressed for this use regarding, and setting aside for a moment whether the use is allowed or not, and then having a public hearing. And that's certainly one path forward, to have that initial public hearing. But the risk from that, and the reason why I haven't recommended that to the board, is that you may find yourselves having, first of all, done that work, or completed that work and submitted it, having a public hearing, and then having a positive declaration, which means is that you're going to have extensive additional review, associated with that, and plans may change, but that certainly is path forward. Amongst the others, resubmit, have Liz do another review, adopt a pause deck,
Again,
pick a card, any card.
Yeah, but again, I guess I'm not really understanding what technical information is critical here. I understand the use comments, I understand the traffic comments. I'm not really sure what technical comments I'm looking for direction now. I'm not really sure I understand what you're looking for from the site
Does the board
civil.
see fit with allowing Mr. Bodendorf and our consultant to have a conversation about what technical details might be or would need to be included to be considered a complete submission for the benefit of as Mr. Briscoe identified as Avenue 4 forward, path 4, I should say.
For instance, Dominic, there's been a detailed grading plan developed to the extent that we know the cut and fills and we know it's a balanced site. I mean, we've done the drainage calculations. We know we can meet all the criteria of the stormwater requirements, the DEC stormwater requirements. Well, yeah, there's a detailed lighting plan put together. I think the plans have been developed, what I would expect even beyond, to a point that's beyond what would be necessary for the level that the project's currently at for a determination of whether the use is appropriate. So, and if I'm wrong, I'm just really looking for the piece that you're looking for.
Well, I can summarize what I read in the two CPL memos and summarize it up.
Go ahead.
We are missing the following site plan set sheets: existing conditions, demolition, if any, landscaping plan, erosion and sediment control, construction details, sign details, the full SWIP, architectural details of proposed building materials, colors, including submission of material sample board. Now, those are things that have been mentioned previously that would be normally part of a full site plan submission, which, as Dominic mentioned, may or may not be the way the board or the applicant wants to go at this point. It is the way that you would have to go for a full GML county referral. So that's a completely different topic.
Yeah, and honestly, I felt like, my understanding was that the applicant may be hedging a little bit, not knowing whether the use aspect.
Absolutely.
So I think we all kind of recognize that, so we've repeated some of these things that need to be provided. I'm not sure what the question is. I mean, I think we've written memos to indicate what is needed.
Okay.
And,
all right. Now,
I think another submittal would be a good step.
We'll start with that. I think we've heard the board and its consultants loud and clear as far as that's concerned.
With all respect, Larry.
All the paths that have been brought up tonight are certainly appreciated as far as understanding our internal and external, moves forward. So there's information that we can, or if we don't provide, then that closes certain paths, it seems. But we're certainly trying to present to you all from a seeker standpoint, again, our perspective being, hey, type 2 action, you wouldn't be looking at any of this. We'd be looking at the straightforward criteria, but we're not. The board classified us as an unlisted action, so we're providing those materials because that's a broader discussion about the special permit use. Kind of putting the cart before the horse here because, unfortunately, from our side of the aisle, that's how the project is being considered in this action. And while we believe it could be permissively segmented, because we don't know just because we say a use is permitted whether a use would ever be developed, we're here before you and we're going to try and address the information. So we'll bring that back to the applicant and certainly, I think, go from there.
And the other thing is that this board has a pretty, consistent practice of what level of detail they want to see before. And
again, this is a unique
referrals and
it's a
do all
unique
these
application.
things.
It's the first time
This board
we've
is
seen
pretty
it.
consistent. Debbie's, very consistent about what needs to be.
Right. This is not your I think what's been highlighted by the board is this is not your traditional site plan or your traditional, I can't even say the word anymore, traditional review. It's a special permit review of a specific use that we're contemplating. So we hear you. We're trying to work together
to make this hopefully something that when the community really looks into this and sees comparatively what it might otherwise be under other permitted uses in the district, that this would be a good use and consistent with the existing other uses that are permitted, but hopefully one of less impact.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Happy anniversary.
All right.
What else is on?
So, anything else that board members or staff would like to bring up? We don't have to go to other business now because we already did that. Anything that our consultants would like to bring up? Or any questions that you might have, Liz?
I mean, I still do have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
But most of them have to do with why or why not.
All right, well, I think that'll do it for tonight. The next meeting of the planning board is scheduled for Thursday, April 13th, and the submission deadline for that meeting is Wednesday, March 29th. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion made.
Felix, is there a second?
I'll second it, too.
And what is your vote, Felix? Do you vote yes?
Yes.
All right, Felix.
Felix and Felix?
Felix and Felix.
Felix squared?
Felix cubed. All right, thanks, everybody.
Look, I referred to the CDA. That's a separate issue.